Thank you so much, Sandy, and good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so my presentation will be introducing you to the concept of agrivoltaics. And the presentation actually links pretty well to two presentations that we heard yesterday. The first one that Mike gave in the morning, where he provided a global perspective of berry production, and he pointed out that energy cost is a significant issue in berry production, and agrivoltaics further down the track might help maybe to deal with that problem. And the other presentation was delivered by Tom in the afternoon, which was about climate forecasts, climate change, and he talked about mitigation strategies, and he said we will need to make sure that we are transferring into renewable energy, and he mentioned solar as one of the solutions. It's not too much of a surprise. And he also said that electrification of farms will be really important to go forward to reduce emissions. And again, agrivoltaics, as you will learn, might help to solve that problem and might be the solution for some selected production systems going forward. So what is actually agrivoltaics or plant production agrivoltaics? It's when crops and energy are co-generated on the same area of land rather than on competing stretches of land. So rather than having your solar farm on that corner of your farm and maybe the crop production system on the other, you put actually the solar panels on top of the crops. Why would you do that? Well, there's 4 potential benefits that are associated with that system. The first one is pretty obvious, which is that you increase the land use efficiency. That means you're producing crops and electricity on the same area of land, and that increases the efficiency of that land. But there's also proposed benefits actually for the crops when you create that slightly different microclimate. And the first one relates to that crops are protected from extreme weather events. For example, there's a protection of the crops from high radiation, there's amelioration of high temperature stresses, as well as physical events like hailstorm or something like that might be ameliorated by the solar panels taking the heavy load and the crops underneath being actually protected. Another aspect that's important is in terms of water relations. So it has been shown that evapotranspiration, so the loss of water from the soil and the plants, is reduced when you have that structure on top, simply because you introduce that shaded environment, and that helps actually to save costs on irrigation. And the last proposed benefit relates to the panel efficiency itself. So panel efficiency is dependent on temperature, and when you have a lush green canopy underneath those panels, that actually benefits the efficiency of the panels, so more electricity is being produced. So saying so, when I introduced that concept, many people would say, but hello, plants need light energy that drives photosynthesis, and photosynthesis underpins plant growth, productivity, yield, and quality aspects. And that is very true. We can see that very easily with the basic function of photosynthesis. Plants are amazing, just take up CO2 from the atmosphere, water from the soil, and with the energy from the sun, they are able to produce sugars, which underpins growth and productivity. However, it doesn't mean that the more light we have, the more photosynthesis, the more growth, the more productivity, the better yield and quality. And that's that plants actually experience excess light energy pretty much on a daily basis, and that's particularly true for Australia because we have very high light intensity in this country. That can be easily demonstrated with a very simple light response curves, but it's basic foundation knowledge of any plant physiologist. What does it mean? This is when we measure photosynthetic rates in response to increasing light intensity. So we start at 0 light, so darkness, and then we increase stepwise the light intensity until we are at very bright light, 2000 ppft. ppft stands for photosynthetic photon flux density. And you can see clearly that, yes, at the beginning, as you increase the light intensity, photosynthesis increases steeply, and plants can really utilize every single additional photon. However, at around 800, 900 ppft, photosynthesis is saturated. We call that light saturation, and all that additional energy plants can actually not use. Okay? So you might wonder, how often does it happen? Well, in Australia, pretty often. And we can see that with the next graph that's taken from a publication that was coming out from Wagga Wagga. So they measured the light intensities in a vineyard throughout the growing season, and all the data points in that pinkish cloud, they would indicate when there was excess light energy, so somewhere in that region. So it's quite common. What do plants do under those conditions with that excess energy? Well, they have protective mechanisms, so they get rid of that energy in form of heat. That's one way. They actually involve antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin E, not so different to us, glutathione, to get rid of that excess energy. However, when those protective systems are exploited to the max, then what we see is that there's cell death, and visually that would show up as sunburned leaves, sunburned fruit, or even, scorched dead leaves in the end. That whole story gets worse when we add high temperature stress and water stress. So coming back to agrivoltaics, the question is, can we create with agrivoltaics an environment that actually provides enough light so plants can actually photosynthesize at their maximum capacity, but we get rid of some of that damaging light that the plants actually don't really need for productivity? So what I did next was looking at the studies that are published and tested real crops underneath such agrivoltaic settings internationally. And then I just made a simple table and I compared how were crop or growth affected by those changed conditions. And I don't want you to focus on too many details here, maybe just those 3 columns. I gave a tick on the left side if there was an advantage, so plants were growing better underneath those agrivoltaics systems, if there was no change, or whether there was a disadvantage, so a reduction in yield. And when I had finished the table, I looked at it and thought, this is really messy. There's no clear picture at all. So I was digging a bit deeper into all those different publications, and I just would like to share with you one case study that makes it quite clear that it's quite complex. So if you consider going forward with agrivoltaics, it would need quite a bit of unraveling. That's a study from Germany. So they have one of the really big agrivoltaics research stations there going on in Hohenheim. And you can see here on the left side, that would be their field. That indicates the agrivoltaics test facility, and it's their control. Here you can see it in action. They're introducing about 30% shade onto their crops. And they tested potato, among other crops. And what they found was in the first year, they had a yield reduction of 18%. So 18% less potatoes when they were grown underneath the agrivoltaics facility. But in 2018, the potato yield was actually increased by 11%. So what was the difference? Well, 2018 was a hot and dry year, and the authors concluded that yield penalties are likely under agrivoltaics facilities, but if you have a hot and dry season, it can be actually an advantage. For time reasons, I can't give you more examples here, but when I dug through the literature, it became clear that the interactions are very intense. So it will play a role where you install your agrivoltaics facility, whether that's a hot and dry climate or in more like a temperate setting. It will depend on the season that you're facing. It depends on the crop type you're working with. It goes down to the variety as well as the facility that you put on top. How much shade do you introduce? What is the height of that facility? What's the tilt, and so on. So going forward, I think if we consider testing agrivoltaics in crop production systems, there's a lot of unraveling that needs to be done to get the design right for that particular location and that particular crop type to get the maximum outcome of such an arrangement. The next aspect that I looked at was water relations, because obviously water is really important, particularly in an Australian context. And there the story was quite different. So generally there's really a positive effect that all of those studies found on water relations in crop production systems when you put agrivoltaics on top. One nice example on berries that shows it in a little bit more detail that comes from Chile and blueberry production. A little bit of background, like all countries pretty much, there is the pressure obviously to increase renewable energy sources, and it's clear that it would be best to put those renewable energy sources close to the consumption centers. So this is pretty much where agricultural land is currently located as well, so there is kind of a competition. At the same time, Chile had a huge drought, sorry, that was the wrong button, between 2010 and 2019 that significantly impacted particularly blueberry production. So what the authors of this study did, they were modeling actually what would happen if we put agrivoltaics over the blueberry production systems in Chile. What would that do to irrigation needs, and what would it do to in terms of changing to renewable energy? And they found that there was a significant reduction in evapotranspiration in blueberry production when those panels were sitting on top, and that led to a 15% lower irrigation need for those production systems. So it's quite significant. In cubic meter, that would correspond to about, I think, 18 million cubic meters of water that are saved when you have panels sitting on top. Of interest was also that particularly the farms that had the strongest drought stress experiences during that drought stress period, they had the largest reduction in irrigation demand, so another good outcome. And in addition, about 22% of the national energy demand could be covered with the electricity produced by those panels integrated into blueberry systems. So quite a promising scenario. So what's the situation now in Australia? When we talk about agrivoltaics, there's actually, it doesn't always relate to plant production. You can also integrate actually animals into solar farms, and that is something that's actually becoming more common in Australia. You might have heard about solar grazing. This is when they put actually sheep into solar arrays, and has been found that this is pretty successful. First of all, easier to manage the solar farm because the sheep actually keep down the vegetation underneath, but it's also really beneficial actually for the sheep. It has been shown that lamb mortality, for example, is decreased because there's more shelter, but also wool quality goes up because the sheep experiencing less heat stress. But going back to plant production, agrivoltaics, there's very little happening actually in Australia at the moment. We have 2 experiments running. So Ag Victoria, they were the first ones who installed actually panels over pairs at their Tatura smart farm, and they are investigating the responses there since 3-4 years. And then we at the University of Melbourne, we just installed a few months ago an agrivoltaics facility at the University of Melbourne Tukey campus, and we are utilizing actually a vineyard for that. And there is a project that's going to be launched very shortly, in a month. Contracting is happening at the moment. That's led by the University of Western Australia. This is a different approach where we're actually trying to see whether we can use conventional solar farms for planting a variety of crops underneath, so which crops would be suitable. So this is kind of capturing what's happening in the agrivoltaics space at the moment in plant production. But we really believe, the scientists who are interested in the concept, that there is more in there, and we would like to test it on further promising crops, particularly with a focus on high-value crops like berries or other horticultural crops. In terms of berries, we would be particularly interested because they obviously come originally from a forest understory background, so they are generally pretty good with tolerating shadier conditions. And Hermelink et al., again, wrong button, actually published a paper last year where they investigated whether berries would be a good contender for agrivoltaics settings going forward. And they found that indeed most berries, particularly if they come from high light intensity environments, would do really well under those agrivoltaics conditions, so something to consider. Bringing that back to Victoria, collaborators and myself, we would love to go ahead and start maybe with strawberries, putting maybe an agrivoltaics facility over a current production system, and we would hypothesize or we believe there would be benefits to that crop in relation to preventing sunburn. So strawberries are obviously quite susceptible to sunburn, as well as the leaves as well, so there could be some protection coming from those panels. Also, protection from hail would be, I think, a good hypothesis that this might make a good difference. Also, charcoal rot obviously is a huge problem in strawberry, and it seems to be worse when you have very hot conditions and combined with water stress. So again, creating the different environment, taking away that temperature and radiation pressure, and maybe decreasing water stress might help with taking care of that charcoal rot problem. We would generally expect improved water relations by installing agrivoltaics in strawberry production systems. As mentioned before, it reduces evapotranspiration. But aside of that, it would create actually improved working conditions for pickers and other workers. And that's something that I experienced by myself when I did measurements in the vineyard this year. I much more preferred to measure the grapevines underneath the panels than outside in the harsh sun. Definitely a difference. And I can also say the birds love it. They accumulate underneath the panels quite heavily. And finally, it would really help, and that links again back to Tom's presentation, the shift to renewable energy, because you have your solar panels within your farm and you can use that electricity to run your irrigation, your cooling, if you have, for example, and that helps, to shift towards net zero emissions on farm and get those environmental credentials as well. Okay, so the final slide that I would like to share with you is when we started with that agrivoltaics project. It's pretty young, still only a year and a half old. We actually, my colleague and I from Uni Melbourne, we did a little social study. So we interviewed potential key players in that agrivoltaic space, or who could become key players, about their opinions, what they think about that concept, and what would be their motivations, or what they think could be pitfalls with that concept. So we interviewed growers, farming organizations, and representatives from the energy sector, and that's what was coming out of it. So in terms of motivations, they repeated pretty much what I showed now during the presentation. So benefits for crop protection, benefits in terms of water relations. What was new was, and what I quite liked, is support structure for plants, so that you actually use that scaffolding where the panels sit on top for support of your plants, or some management instruments or something like that. Was a neat idea. In terms of energy perspectives, of course, it would mean that the farm relies on clean energy, which is positive. We have cost savings on energy costs, which is big, and possibly even income if you feed surplus energy into the grid, if you don't do it at peak time, because then you pay probably. It enhances the reputation because you're changing into that more greener sphere. You have arable land, requires less preparation, so fairly easy to install those structures. And then general comments where this is a great story, carbon sequestration benefits, and it could be a win-win combo. There were also some pitfalls, and they were also very insightful. First of all, yield was a concern, so we would need to really make sure we get those systems right for that particular crop we are interested in, so we don't have those yield penalties, or at least stay at the same yield. Then you still win because you also have electricity on top. Management implications, very valuable comments. You don't want to change your management because you have the machinery and so on lined up, so that should work as per usual. They were scared of reduced flexibility once you have those structures in, also a very valuable consideration. In terms of energy, the structure itself a significant investment, which is very true. They are at the moment prototypes. Prototypes are never cheap, but if this is something that is really beneficial, then the costs will come back. It's just a matter of scale. Grid connectivity issues can be, if you want to fit into the grid, sometimes the grid just can't take it anymore. I think there's lots of solar farms approved at the moment that can't be built because the grid is just not possible. It's just not able to take up that electricity. And general comments were not suitable to all industries, certainly true. Uncertain return on investment, valuable point. Legal aspects like permissions and so on, also important. And we definitely don't want that agrivoltaics just becomes an expensive solar energy production. Just some food for thought. Okay, I think that's it from my side. Thank you.